This series was made possible by the Friends of Humanities Kansas.
Welcome to Kansas 1972. A lot happened during that pivotal year, including the founding of Humanities Kansas. So, in celebration of our 50th anniversary, we'll be telling you stories from that era of Kansas history. So tune in, chill out, and get the lowdown on 1972.
I'm a friend of the earth, and I used to go swimming in clear, fragrant waters that rolled in the sun. And I swam real good for as long as I could, till the energy crisis begun. And the water drank the radiation leaking from the plant by the hill, by the pond, by the sea. And the fish all up and died, with me not far behind. And I'll swim no more in the sea.
In 1972, the same year Humanities Kansas was founded, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, the United Nations held its first conference on the human environment, the Club of Rome published The Limits to Growth, and the Keep America Beautiful campaign tried to persuade people to stop throwing trash pretty much everywhere but waste cans. The era of the late 1960s and early 1970s is really when environmental issues become important concerns for many Americans. When the first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970, tens of thousands of individuals across the country engaged in community cleanup projects and listened to speakers extol the importance of environmental conservation. And Kansans were a part of this larger awakening. In the early 1970s, the Kansas Committee for the Humanities, now Humanities Kansas, issued a number of grants to Kansas communities that facilitated discussions on issues like the effects of industrialization on air and water quality, land use concerns, and how environmental problems would affect Kansans' quality of life. In today's episode, we'll hear Kansas stories from this era of environmental issues entering the public consciousness. We'll learn about plans by the U.S. government to put a nuclear waste disposal site in Kansas.
The search for a solution has led the Atomic Energy Commission to the prairies of Kansas.
And how a bipartisan political effort in the state eventually quashed this idea.
Kansas and no other state in the Union is morally or legally obligated to serve as a garbage dump.
You'll hear about early efforts in the 1970s to establish a Tallgrass Prairie Preserve.
We've had bills in and out of Congress for a preserve or a national park status in Kansas. And because of the local opposition, all of those bills died in Congress.
And how one woman's integration of art and science helped bring public attention to the prairie.
She saw that something had to be done if we were going to preserve this amazing landscape.
But first, we head deep into the ground in central Kansas.
Down a mine shaft in central Kansas, more than 1,000 feet underground, is a huge abandoned salt mine where the Atomic Energy Commission hopes to literally salt away steadily mounting piles of radioactive waste.
The Wichita Eagle, December 31st, 1972. Kansans in 1972 proved that they could buck big government and win when they stood together against the Atomic Energy Commission's proposal to set up a nuclear waste dump in Kansas. Their actions prompted Kansas news editors to list the fight as the #1 Kansas news story of 1972.
While the attempt by the U.S. government to use the salt mines outside of Lyons, Kansas, as a storage facility for nuclear waste was the biggest news story in Kansas in 1972, the story stretches back a bit farther. The site selection was initially announced in June of 1970, but it took 2 years for Kansans who opposed this measure to prevail. And indeed, they did prevail, since today there is no nuclear waste buried deep underground in Kansas. Well, at least that we know of, right? But before we get into the specifics of the Kansas part of this story, I wanted to get a better understanding of the larger history of nuclear waste in the U.S., and why the Lyons site was identified in the first place. To do so, I spoke with Tom Wellick, the historian at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This is the U.S. government agency that regulates civilian use of radioactive materials and was established in 1974. Its precursor agency was the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC.
The Atomic Energy Commission was born out of World War II, but early on, it was mostly about secrecy, the Cold War, and protecting our atomic secrets. That ultimately changes in 1953. Dwight Eisenhower gives his speech to the United Nations, the Atoms for Peace address, where he basically proposes that instead of excessive secrecy, that the United States was going to bring the blessings of atomic energy to the rest of the world.
The United States knows that peaceful power from atomic energy is no dream of the future. That capability, already proved, is here, now, today. Who can doubt if the entire body of the world's scientists and engineers had adequate amounts of fissionable material with which to test and develop their ideas, that this capability would rapidly be transformed into universal, efficient, and economic usage?
And so from that speech, we have the 1954 Act, and it gives the AEC a much more public role to promote the blessings of nuclear energy, both for the use of isotopes, nuclear power plants, and the like, any kind of uses that might benefit society. So the AEC by the 1950s and 1960s is interested in trying to encourage the use of nuclear power plants. And so that means you're going to create a new stream of waste, essentially, that is produced by commercial licensees. And so by the 1960s, that is becoming an increasing concern.
In the 1960s, the AEC initially looked at sites in Washington state and Idaho for the disposal of these waste streams. Issues with potential tank leakages raised concerns in Washington, and in Idaho, objections from a prominent U.S. senator from the state eventually took it out of the running. By 1970, they needed another option.
So that means that the AEC immediately has to kind of pivot and quickly find a solution to these kind of growing waste concerns. And they had, because of the research that had been done in the 1950s recommending salt formations, they had begun doing research, and they had basically contracted with a salt company in the Lyons area to do research. They weren't doing anything with radioactive wastes. They were simply doing tests to answer technical questions about whether salt formations would actually be appropriate.
The search for a solution has led the Atomic Energy Commission to the prairies of Kansas for Project Salt Vault. Scientists believe the vast deposits of salt out here will make an ideal container for radioactive materials. They started some experiments here about 3 years ago to prove the point.
Large concentrations of salt deposits can be found deep underground across central Kansas. These formed around 250 million years ago when the ancient ocean that once covered the region evaporated. Salt mining as an industry in Kansas began in the late 1800s, with the Lyons salt mine opening in 1917. Operations in Lyons and elsewhere in the area still continue to the present. Today, probably the best-known salt mines in the state are in Hutchinson, which is home to the Underground Salt Museum. It's actually a pretty cool attraction. I highly recommend it. The Hutchinson salt mines are also noteworthy for providing storage for high-security items that require constant temperature and humidity, such as classic films and valuable artworks. But there are other possible uses for the salt mines, such as storing materials you kind of want to get far away from people. So in the late 1960s, the AEC started looking at the Lyons salt mines as a disposable solution for the waste produced by nuclear power plants. So why put radioactive waste in salt mines?
For one thing, salt is dry. Wherever there's salt, there can be no underground rivers that might be the source of somebody's drinking water. Salt is also stable, unlike rock, which can shift with an earthquake or the passage of time. It's estimated this salt has been here for 200 million years. Burial of the waste is to begin in 1975 here in vaults like this. It'll be shipped here in canisters. A dozen or so canisters will be sunk into holes in a single vault. The holes and the vault will then be filled with salt. Heat from the radiation will fuse the salt into a hard and leak-proof substance.
But the burying of the waste did not begin in 1975. A coalition of Kansans from across the political spectrum made sure that this never happened. Interestingly enough, much of that opposition did not initially come from many residents of Lyons.
Well, of course, the hopes are real high that this storage of atomic waste in the salt mine will provide jobs locally, a real fine aid to the economic area here, but even more important, we hope that this will really be a contribution to American power development by providing a place to store these wastes.
That's Robert Briscoe, the mayor of Lyons at the time, being interviewed by a national news program in February of 1971.
Most of Lyons' 4,500 people accepted the government proposal, not only because federal money would stimulate the local economy, but also they believed it was their patriotic duty.
We feel like perhaps it's a method whereby we can be of service to our fellow human beings. And sure, there's some hazard. Anybody would be stupid to say there wasn't a bit of hazard. So if this is a logical place for it, why shouldn't we accept the risk?
Basically, it boils down to trusting what the AEC says it will do, which apparently the rest of the nation does.
While many residents of Lyons seem to have faith in the AEC, this sentiment was not shared by others in the state.
While Lyons residents didn't object to the project, scientists at the University of Kansas did. They were not convinced rock formations above the salt mine, where the nuclear waste was to be buried, could withstand the extreme heat generated by the radioactive material. The university scientists feared the possibility of contamination. It was this argument that convinced a number of state and federal officials that more research was needed. Kansas Congressman Joseph Skubitz was one.
Kansas and no other state in the Union is morally or legally obligated to serve as a garbage dump for the privately owned plants in New York or in California, and to compel any state, Kansas or any state, to agree to do so without first proving the safety factor is just incredible to me.
Joe Skubitz was a Republican member of the Kansas delegation to the U.S. House of Representatives. Skubitz represented a district that covered parts of southeast and south central Kansas, and he became one of the most vocal opponents of the Lyons proposal. Researchers from the Kansas Geological Survey at the University of Kansas had conducted their own study of the site in 1971, and their results were much more skeptical about the safety of the Lyons salt mines for storing this kind of waste. The KU study cited potential problems with leakage issues, as well as concerns that the radioactive waste could not be retrieved if something goes wrong. And this research conducted by local scientists contributed to a sense among some Kansans that the AEC needed to do a lot more to address safety issues.
Our prime reason at this point in time for opposing this project is to make the AEC come in and establish that the project is in fact safe.
That's Ron Baxter, chair of the Kansas Sierra Club at the time.
They want to pat us on the head and say, well, now don't worry about it. Leave all this to us. We'll take care of it, and it'll be safe. This is the same thing that they told the people on several other projects that has turned out have not had the degree of safety that the citizens in those respective states thought at the time they were installed there.
Baxter would be instrumental in the fight against the nuclear waste repository in Kansas. His efforts helped bring the story to national attention.
Associated Press, Denver, October 18, 1971. The Rocky Mountain Executive Council of the Sierra Club took on the Atomic Energy Commission Sunday for the agency's statements regarding the nuclear waste depository at Lyons, Kansas. Ronald Baxter, chairman of the Kansas Sierra Club, said, "The overwhelming sentiment in Kansas is to get the AEC out of the state. This project is so bad that no other state will accept it, and the people of Kansas are beginning to get information concerning the poor prior record of the AEC in this area."
From the perspective of 50 years later, this kind of position may not seem surprising. However, in the early 1970s, opposition to nuclear power had not really developed that much in the U.S. That really doesn't happen until later in the decade, culminating with the 3 Mile Island disaster in 1979. But broader concerns about environmental issues were growing in the American public consciousness in the early 1970s, including in Kansas. Again, Tom Wellick.
There really is a tremendous movement in public opinion in 1969 and 1970 leading up to the National Environmental Policy Act is certainly influencing the thinking of Kansas. And good old Republican Kansas at this point has a Democratic governor, right? So it's an era of possibility where, environmental thinking is really changing dramatically.
It is noteworthy that the National Environmental Policy Act, which established the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, in 1970, was passed under a Republican president, Richard Nixon. And while many politicians in Kansas are from the Republican Party, like Representative Joe Skubitz, Kansas had a popular Democratic governor at the time, Robert Docking. And Docking was also not the biggest fan of the AEC's plan.
Associated Press, Kansas City, Kansas, January 20th, 1972. Governor Robert Docking, saying he is not sure he can believe anything the Atomic Energy Commission says, has pledged to do everything he can to keep a nuclear waste depository out of Kansas.
Given the initial response of many Lyons residents, the AEC was not expecting this kind of opposition in Kansas. In retrospect, Tom Wellick says the AEC probably should have done more research on the suitability of the site before officially announcing it.
I think they thought that there was not going to be significant opposition at the local level as long as they did their homework, produced the studies. And I think that leads to a major mistake by the AEC. They basically decide and defend on this location. They designate Lyons as their place before they had really completed all of the studies. And this kind of clearly offends people in Kansas. And part of this seems to be a misunderstanding on their part about what state level people wanted as far as research done before they made this choice. So yeah, there's a disconnect in their communications with folks at the Kansas level versus what's going on at the headquarters in Washington, D.C.
But even if the AEC had completed all the necessary research prior to announcing the Lyons site, or even if they conducted additional research to investigate the potential issues brought up by the Kansas Geological Survey, one has to wonder if many Kansans still would have supported it. By 1972, it seems clear there are deeper objections going on than just more research is needed. In February of 1972, the Kansas legislature adopted a resolution opposing the AEC's proposed nuclear waste repository in Lyons. The resolution mentioned environmental hazards and insufficient research, but also cited objections of a different kind. Senator Arden Booth, a Republican from Lawrence, expressed these other concerns to the Associated Press on February 7th of 1972.
Even if it were safe, and we're not sure it is, according to the best information available, we don't want the state of Kansas to become known as the atomic waste dump. We've had enough problems outlasting the Dust Bowl image. We need to be about improving our state's image, and being known as the dumping ground for atomic waste certainly won't help.
So fundamentally, this is perhaps a PR issue. Kansas does not want to be seen as an environmental wasteland, yet again, in the popular imagination. That's really bad for business. Couple this argument with the bipartisan objections of major politicians in Kansas, plus the advocacy of Ron Baxter and the Kansas Sierra Club, and the AEC kind of didn't stand a chance. By the end of the summer of 1972, the federal government had given up on the Lyons site. That's the end of the Kansas side of the story. But like me, I'm sure you still want to know, what happened to the nuclear waste? Where did it go? Again, Tom Wellick.
The 1970s was a period where you have growing political opposition to nuclear power generally. So this kind of sort of opposition that occurred in 1970, 71, when Lyons is most controversial, really has become a major full-blown movement by the late 1970s.
In the beginning, energy from the atom was greeted as the savior of mankind. It would make deserts bloom. It would control weather. A little pellet would run the family car for a year. That was in the 1950s and early 60s. Then in 1969 and the years that followed, poison pens were directed like arrows at the nuclear power industry. Nuclear decisions became headline topics and subjects of national controversy.
The failure at the Lyons site, combined with this growing opposition to nuclear power in the 1970s, pushes the U.S. government to explore different avenues. Side note, Kansas experienced some of these anti-nuclear power sentiments in the late 1970s with the construction of the Wolf Creek nuclear power plant, but opponents were unsuccessful and the plant went online in 1985. It's still in operation today and generates 1,200 megawatts of electricity, which is enough to power 800,000 homes. But back to nuclear waste. After research on a number of sites, in 1987, Yucca Mountain in Nevada was identified as the best site for a deep geological depository of radioactive wastes. Of course, just like the Lyons salt mines, the story does not end there. But unlike Lyons, this proposal drags on for decades. Opposition by local residents, Nevada politicians, and Native Americans in the region stalled the operations at the Yucca Mountain facility until it was halted in 2010. Currently, spent fuel rods and other high-level radioactive wastes from nuclear power are stored at about 80 sites in 35 states, mostly at active and decommissioned nuclear power plants. This waste is typically enclosed in steel-lined concrete pools of water or in steel and concrete containers, and it's just sitting there, waiting to be moved maybe to Yucca Mountain or some other long-term storage facility.
That takes us back to where we are now, where we don't have a full solution to the problem.
And part of me, as a Kansan, is happy it's not stored here. But I also recognize that no matter one's view on nuclear power, this waste exists, and it needs to be stored somewhere safer. And all of these not in my backyard sentiments ultimately means these decisions will most likely be based on political calculations and not scientific research. In our next story, we move from deep underground to the tall grasses above the earth.
This is the prairie, sometimes called the American grassland or the Great Plains. It's an open, rolling land, uniquely American in its look and its animals. Yet its richness and productivity reach past our borders to touch the corners of the world. The Great American Prairie is an ancient land, created perhaps 50 million years ago when the Rocky Mountains were thrust up, shedding the sedimentary material which was to become the prairie soil. And the mountains also created the climatic conditions necessary for this vast inland sea of grass.
The North American prairie stretches across the Great Plains from Saskatchewan in the north to Texas in the south, including most of Kansas. It contains 3 types of grasses: short, midgrass, and tall. The tallgrass prairie, found mostly in the eastern portion of this region, at one time covered more than 170 million acres. This rich landscape was home to indigenous peoples for centuries before European contact, but today only about 4% of the tallgrass prairie remains due to over 100 years of plowing, grazing, and other forms of agricultural use.
Our buffalo-strewn prairie is gone now. A few fence-constricted herds are all that remain. Cattle have replaced buffalo in most of the western part of the grassland. And in the eastern part, corn and wheat now grow, where once big blue stem and Indian grass grew tall as a man on horseback. But the character of the prairie can't be destroyed.
The Flint Hills region of Kansas is where much of the tallgrass prairie still survives. And in 1996, a little over 10,000 acres of this vital ecosystem was set aside. Just north of Strong City sits the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, a public-private partnership between the National Park Service and the Nature Conservancy. But the story to protect this vanishing landscape goes back much farther.
The Wichita Eagle, April 28, 1972. The best remaining areas of prairie tallgrass are in Kansas, and something will have to be done soon in Kansas if natural stands of this grass are to be preserved. A grassland park here would preserve not only the native prairie grasses for viewing by future generations, but also the animals using the grasslands.
Well, as far as I can find out, it supported about 300 species of mammals and thousands of kinds of insects and other kinds of life. And I don't think the species of plants have ever really been counted. It's just almost countless. The large mammals, of course, the buffalo, it characterizes the tallgrass prairie the most, I think. There are some elk still surviving. The grizzly bear long ago left for the mountain regions. Some of the mammals that we think of just as mountain animals really were prairie animals also. The eagle is almost gone. That's about it. There are lots of coyotes still left. There are no more prairie wolves. I believe the prairie wolf, the large white wolf, is gone.
That's Patricia Duncan speaking on a national news program about the Tallgrass Prairie in Kansas. The actions of many individuals and organizations were necessary to make the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve a reality. Efforts to conserve portions of the Tallgrass Prairie actually stretch back to the 1920s, with legislative attempts to create a Tallgrass Prairie Park emerging in the 1950s. But it's the 1970s when the political momentum really starts to build. Larry Wynn, a Republican member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Kansas, introduced bills to establish a Tallgrass Prairie National Park pretty much every year from 1971 to 1979. But opposition from other local politicians and area ranchers blocked these efforts. It would take until the mid-1990s before a compromise was reached. The road to establishing a Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve was a long and complicated one. For today, we're focusing on just one individual in this larger story, the artist Patricia Duncan, whose efforts in the 1970s were instrumental in spreading awareness about both the beauty and scientific importance of this ecosystem.
She was a painter, a printmaker, an expert at Japanese-style woodblock printing, a photographer, a naturalist and a student of the ecosystem, an activist who organized people on behalf of saving what's left of the Tallgrass Prairie, and really quite a special writer and the author of several books.
That's Linda Duke, the director of the Beach Museum of Art at Kansas State University. We'll be hearing more from her throughout this story. Patricia was a nature lover long before she became an artist. The daughter of a Boy Scout executive, her childhood was filled with camping, riding horses, and being exposed to the beauty of the natural world. She received an art degree from Washington University in St. Louis, where she met Herb Duncan, an architecture student. They fell in love, got married, and started their long life together. Herb Duncan joined the Navy during the Korean War, and for part of his service, they lived in Japan. During this time, Patricia became deeply connected to Japanese art and culture, including woodblock printmaking, an art form that would influence her work for the rest of her life. In the late 1950s, Herb's service ended, and they moved to the Kansas City area, where Patricia Duncan continued to create and exhibit her artwork. She applied to the MFA program at the University of Kansas in the 1960s, but was turned down because, as her rejection letter stated,
"You are a mother with 2 children. In spite of your very impressive record of exhibitions and recommendations, we suggest that you stay at home with your children. And because our MFA program is very small, we must leave room for all male students, as they, in time, will need to support a family."
And we know from previous episodes of this podcast that kind of sexism was pretty common at the time. Undeterred by this rejection, Patricia attended classes at the Kansas City Art Institute and later became an instructor there. But she was restless. She wrote in her journal in January of 1967, "I must paint. It is the act of doing that seems to be the thing with me." And just a few years later, her need for doing would be transformed into a new medium, photography, and a new subject matter, the preservation of the tallgrass prairie. To help better understand Patricia Duncan's life and work, I spoke with Herb Duncan, a retired architect and Patricia's husband. Herb told me the story of how Patricia first learned about the tallgrass prairie.
It all happened in June of 1971 when she saw an article in the Kansas City Star about a professor of mammalogy at the University of Kansas who has been trying to get a national tallgrass prairie park formed by the government for years. And he and other scientists have been trying to do this but getting nowhere because the public thought of the prairie as a place to drive across the state of Kansas as fast as possible to get to the Rocky Mountains. That's the perception. And they couldn't change it because their orientation was scientific and there was no excitement about the prairie the way that they presented it, so they were getting nowhere with the park.
That mammalogy professor was Dr. E. Raymond Hall, a well-respected academic who had been at the University of Kansas since the 1940s. After reading that article, Patricia Duncan contacted Dr. Hall, and together they visited a prairie preserve near Manhattan, Kansas. Here's Patricia Duncan speaking about her first visit to the Tallgrass Prairie in an interview from the 1980s.
A very famous professor of Kansas University, Dr. E. Raymond Hall, kind of took me under his wing. He's one of the great prairie scientists of the world and great mammalogists, and we went on many trips together, and he painstakingly taught me from scratch what native grasses and plants and wildflowers and animals were on the prairie and what it used to look like, and I just felt like it was an underdog landscape and needed a champion.
Before that time, she had done various kinds of landscapes and experimented with different styles. But I really think from that point on, her activism and her work as an artist just meshed completely.
This meshing of art and activism, as Linda Duke just put it, came together through her love of the prairie. Again, Herb Duncan.
And so Pat saw all the beauty there, and I think that's the day that she fell in love with the prairie, because from then on, it was a 7-year adventure as an advocacy for the Tallgrass Park, and probably the biggest proponent of it from the standpoint of the beauty of the prairie, not the scientific part of just preserving a piece of land. She told Dr. Hall, I can help you with this, because if I photograph these beautiful flowers and the grasses and show them to people in presentations, they can't help but see why there should be a park.
To deepen her artistic understanding, Patricia Duncan became a devoted student of the Tallgrass Prairie.
Pat started out by going to the prairie and making herself familiar with the grasses and the prairie flowers, and she really became expert at what they were, their common names, their scientific names, and knew equal to a scientist would know about such things. And she took photographs with her camera and created slides of all these images.
The preserve she visited is known as the Konza Prairie Biological Station, which is located outside of Manhattan in the Flint Hills region of Kansas. It was established by Kansas State University in 1971 for research and educational purposes. But since Konza is a space for scientific investigation, it has limited public access. Duncan and others felt a separate park elsewhere in the Flint Hills was needed for the general public's enjoyment. So she began using her camera to promote this idea.
The Wichita Beacon, July 8, 1973. Patricia Duncan is an artist photographer who is one of many Americans determined to save the lush native tall grasses that once covered 400,000 square miles of prairie. Their beauty and variety are indicated in her photos. The pictures reflect the greatness and subtlety of the prairie in long-range views and close-ups of grasses, sunflowers, milkweeds, and other native plants. She would like others to be able to grasp the beauty and the cohesiveness of the prairie ecology and see the contrast between closely cropped pastures and the luxuriant growth on the original prairie.
Duncan would travel around the state giving slideshow presentations of her photographs, sometimes with Dr. Hall lecturing about the prairie environment. She also exhibited her photos at various sites, helping people to visualize both the beauty and ecological complexity of the tallgrass prairie. In 1973, Patricia was one of the founders of a group called Save the Tallgrass Prairie, a grassroots political action group dedicated to persuading lawmakers to set aside a portion of the tallgrass prairie for protection. While they were one of multiple organizations promoting the idea of a tallgrass prairie preserve in the region, Save the Tallgrass Prairie was notable for organizing a series of conferences, the first one taking place in 1973. Again, Herb Duncan.
It was a really well-attended conference, and they had a program of 16 speakers, and Pat was the moderator and conducted all this. And the people that came, David Bauer, who was the president and founder of Friends of the Earth, Richard Curry, who was with the United States Department of Interior, Dr. Hall was there, who was still advocating and supporting Pat, Dr. Hilbert, who was the founder of the Kansas Prairie that became a favorite place for Pat to photograph, Ron Kataski, who was the head of the National Audubon Society in Kansas, Gerald Onefeather, who was the president of the Oglala Sioux Landowners Association. All these people came and gave talks, and they had this stimulating meeting that just really supported the park.
Associated Press, Elmdale, Kansas, October 1st, 1973. An estimated 300 people interested in the proposal for Tallgrass Prairie National Park gathered here this weekend, and some of them left feeling they were at least one step closer to a park. The conference brought together park supporters, environmentalists, and a good number of Flint Hills residents and cattlemen. Representative Larry Wynn, Republican from Kansas, who introduced the bill in July to authorize Congress to fund a prairie park, said his bill faced an uphill fight.
So why exactly was the park an uphill battle? Why were some Kansans opposed to the idea of a Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve?
I mean, it sounds like everybody would love the beauty of the prairie, but there were also the people that owned the prairie, the ranchers, and the ranchers were absolutely, totally opposed to the idea of a national park because they thought it would be like Disneyland and people would come and tear up the prairie with their cars and too many people.
The Parsons Sun, August 30th, 1973. Tallgrass Prairie National Park advocates and opponents squared off today in testimony before the Kansas legislature. Representatives of Save the Tallgrass Prairie Incorporated urge preservation of a park area where the public could learn about a major ecological system. Claire Robinson, president-elect of the Kansas Livestock Association, said, "This land is in pretty good hands. People are trying to manage it. Nobody wants to destroy the land." Paul Fleener, lobbyist for the Farm Bureau, testified that the establishment of a park would have adverse effects on agriculture generally and livestock production in particular. These lush grasses have been maintained through the years by the tireless efforts of livestock producers and are, today, in the best condition they have ever been in.
Throughout the 1970s, during all these conflicts over the preserve, Patricia Duncan kept a journal while she was visiting the prairie and taking photographs. In 1978, these writings and photos were published as a book called Tallgrass Prairie, The Inland Sea. It's a beautiful collection of images and words about the tallgrass ecosystem from one of its fiercest advocates. You can still find used copies around. I picked up one and found it incredibly moving. I spoke with Linda Duke about this book.
Stuart Udall, who had been the Secretary of the Interior under both Kennedy and Johnson, was an ally of Patricia's. She sought his help in this effort to save the Tallgrass Prairie. And I was really struck by something he wrote in the foreword to her book. He said, that there was hostility locally and lack of awareness nationally to the idea that we were losing this precious ecosystem. So there was quite a lot of effort put into how not only the general public, but lawmakers could be educated on that point.
Probably Patricia Duncan's most significant effort to educate people about the Tallgrass Prairie was an exhibit for the Smithsonian Institution that she created in 1976.
She began working with the Smithsonian to put together a traveling exhibition that was made up of her photographs and based on the research that she gathered. It consisted of 40 panels. The title was The Tallgrass Prairie, an American Landscape, and it was toured by the Smithsonian and visited, I believe, all 50 states between 1976 and 1986. It was a huge effort to get more people to understand how unique and precious that landscape was.
And her exhibition turned out to be one of the most popular ones. It went to all 50 states. There were 3 copies that went by overland truck for 10 years all over the country. It was spectacular. I mean, she organized it. She found all the images. There were 40 framed panels that were oak framed. They were 40 by 30 and 20 by 30 of the historic prairie and the prairie today, which was 1976. It was a wonderful presentation.
By the time her Smithsonian Institution traveling exhibition ended its run in the mid-1980s, Patricia Duncan had been advocating for a Tallgrass Prairie Preserve for over 15 years. In a 1985 interview, Duncan expresses her optimism a preserve would soon be established.
Well, at this point, after I have really been battling for this thing myself since 1970, and we've had bills in and out of Congress for a preserve or a national park status in Kansas. And because of the local opposition, all of those bills died in Congress. But this new preserve idea, I think, presents the best and the most realistic chance to tie up the land, at least, we're talking many, many generations to come, and we want something for our children to experience what, for instance, my grandmother experienced.
It took another decade of negotiations, but in the 1990s, an agreement was reached after Kansas Senator Nancy Kassebaum created a commission that brought together the various advocates and skeptics to find a compromise. And in 1996, the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve finally opened as a public-private partnership. Herb Duncan remembers when Patricia attended the opening ceremony.
And she was there at the dedication in 1996 and was singled out by Nancy Kassebaum for what she had done and for the fact that she had a major part in creating a park, or the beginning of a park, which exists today and is seen by hundreds of people every year.
That could be the end of the story. How Tallgrass Prairie Preserve supporters like Patricia Duncan finally realized their dream decades later. However, the influence of Patricia's work about the prairie does not end there. Herb Duncan and Linda Duke tell the story of the second life of Patricia's traveling Smithsonian exhibit.
Years later, Pat got a call from the dean of the School of Architecture at Kansas State University, who happened to be a friend of ours. And he said that a janitor had found these boxes in the bottom of the School of Architecture building under a stairway. And he thought Pat was related to him. And we went up and opened the boxes, and it was a copy of the exhibition, all years later.
They had found these 40 large photographic panels that make up the exhibition. And they had to go. And so they wanted to know if the museum could take them. They are big and heavy, and we are really pressed for storage space here at the museum. And the late Cheryl Collins, who was the director of the Riley County Historical Museum, agreed to take them on a pretty temporary basis. And so we did get them moved over there, and they stayed there for a couple of years. But then I got the call from Cheryl too, saying we can't keep these. And so at that point, I was able to get a photographer to go over and take professional, high quality digital photographs of each panel. We had the idea to preserve those both on our website and on a large touchscreen installation that we were working on as part of the Prairie Studies initiative. We wanted people to be able to learn about Kansa prairie, to be able to learn about native plants, and to be able to learn about artworks in the museum's collection that were directly inspired by this landscape.
You can view digital images of all the original 40 exhibition panels both at the Beach Museum of Art at K-State and on the Beach Museum's website. An additional digital panel was added in 2015 with new text by Patricia Duncan reflecting upon the history of the exhibit. Patricia Duncan had an over 6-decade career as a multidisciplinary artist, but the prairie was never far from her mind. The Duncans moved from Kansas City to Maine in 2003, although Patricia had had a studio there since the 1980s. Herb Duncan told me the ocean waves of the Maine coastline reminded Patricia of the movement of the tallgrass prairie blowing in the wind. Perhaps Duncan's most iconic work is her painting, Red Prairie with Bison, often referred to as just Red Bison, on view currently at the Beach Museum of Art.
It's really Pat's signature painting, because she was always a painter first. It shows sort of ghost-like bison on a red prairie with a bright blue sky in the background.
Red Bison is, like many of Patricia's works, kind of complicated. It's a collage work, so it's a painting, but there are pieces of paper glued onto it, and there are even pieces of photographs glued onto it and then painted over. This looming form of a bison is the main feature, but the bold red color just conjures up so many things about the prairie to viewers, not only the majestic sunsets that we often see over the prairie, but also the power of prairie fires.
Duncan painted Red Bison in 1990, but it was gifted to the Beach Museum in 1998 by former Senator Nancy Kassebaum, who, if you remember, was another instrumental figure in the establishment of the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve. And this connection between political action and art reminds me of another connection in Duncan's work, the interplay of art and science. Earlier in this episode, Linda Duke mentioned the Prairie Studies Initiative. This is a program at Kansas State University that brings together artists, scientists, and others with a deep knowledge of the prairie to create conversations across disciplinary divides. Part of their mission is to employ the arts to make academic research about the prairie accessible to a broader public. Patricia Duncan participated in multiple events at the Prairie Studies Initiative, and her work is the perfect example of this intertwining of art and science.
I think Patricia is, to me, an interdisciplinary figure, not only in that she pursued with great skill many works in very different media, but also her ongoing passionate interest in science and the science that allowed her to learn about and argue on behalf of the land. Patricia is a good example of the ways that art can help us understand complicated things. projects. And anything to do with the science of the environment, all the things we've learned about the microbial qualities of the soil underneath the unplowed prairie, or about the potential of the grasses and other plants that grow there. They're all complicated interrelationships. And I think Patricia lived that as an artist and maximized that in her efforts to help people understand the landscape.
Patricia Duncan passed away in September of 2021. But her legacy lives on in her incredible body of artistic work, which you can find at the Beach Museum of Art at K-State, the Spencer Museum of Art at KU, and other museums in the region and across the country. You can also feel her legacy when you walk the trails of the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, or anywhere you can catch a glimpse of this vanishing ecosystem.
These are the gardens of the desert. These the unshorn fields, boundless and beautiful, for which the speech of England has no name. The prairies. So said William Cullen Bryant. The prairies, born, developed, grown to maturity over thousands of years by trial and error. Which grasses will live to be born over and over again? Which will die out quietly and be lost forever?
5 decades ago, in the early 1970s, environmental issues were reaching into the broader American public consciousness. And as we saw in today's stories, Kansans were a part of this ecological awakening. This was a broad shift encompassing long-standing interests in conservation and preservation, as well as newer concerns about pollution, waste, and sustainability. And just like today, the politics of environmental issues were very complicated and oftentimes divisive. In this U.S. Department of Energy documentary from 1972, we hear perspectives that are eerily familiar to 2022 years.
Some ecologists feel the damage man has committed is irreversible, and that the biosphere as we know it is doomed. The more hopeful outlooks are based on man's accepting the fact that nature is not endlessly bountiful and does not exist just for man to conquer.
Just like 50 years ago, Kansans know today the beauty, diversity, and sustainability of their land and resources is not guaranteed. It's up to us to think globally and act locally. Catch you on the flip side.
Humanities Kansas is an independent nonprofit leading a movement of ideas to strengthen Kansas communities and our democracy. Since 1972, HK's pioneering programs, grants, and partnerships have documented and shared stories to spark conversations and generate insights. Together with statewide partners and supporters, HK invites all Kansans to draw on history, literature, and culture to enrich their lives and to serve the communities and state we all proudly call home. Join the movement of ideas at humanitieskansas.org.